Welcome to another Village Torah session, discussion on the Torah portion. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew, and we are still very much in the book of Deuteronomy. We have this week's Torah portion is Ki Tetzei. Now, there's a lot going through this Torah portion. If you want to take a look at it, it's there. It is in chapter 21, verse 10 through chapter 25, verse 19, if you want to look at the entirety of the Torah portion. But I'm going to do some highlights. Now, going through the Torah portion, there's a lot. This week's Torah portion has so much in it. It is chock full. Really, it's one of these Torah portions that we could probably do something, just do a whole few month, or even who knows, an entire year cycle just talking about this Torah portion. But we're going to talk about one particular topic. Now, there's a lot that's really fascinating as far as boundaries, separating, making differentiations, distinguishing going on in this Torah portion. Another aspect also involves coupling or decoupling. We have various marriage aspects. We also have divorce. So there's a lot of things involving couples. We're not talking about any of that in this presentation. Actually, in this presentation, I hadn't really noticed it before, but clothing. Actually, I found a half dozen different references to clothing in this week's Torah portion. I don't think we typically talk about clothing when it comes to the Torah, but yet here we have not one, not two, not three or four. We have six different references to clothing. And I just, it screamed out to me to investigate, to discuss. So without further ado, here we have clothing in this week's Torah portions. The first of these six actually is what we open this week's Torah portion up with. It's when you go out to battle and somehow, whatever. I'm not going to go into this because this is an entirely separate, really fascinating discussion about taking a woman, which we typically call an Ashes Yifat To'ar, a beautiful woman, and you desire her. And what happens when you take her? You take her as captive. You're a soldier. So you want to bring her back. And there's this whole procedure. There's this whole process. So you trim her hair, pare her nails. And key to us is discarding her captive's garb. And then after that, she spends an entire month's time in your house, lamenting her father and mother. And then after that, she can be your wife. I'm fascinated. Of course, we have sort of this, getting rid of the outer aspects, the hair, the fingernails, and of course the garments, the clothing. And once one gets rid of these things, it seems like, it's fascinating. I think you don't really get a sense of that with the nails per se, but hair and clothing definitely present. They're like cultural things, right? From one culture to the next, they're representative of a certain culture. I think even to some degree, you could even argue that both finger and toenails can be cultural specific. But I think what's key here is that they're outer aspects. They're things that you can reduce and they grow. If we're thinking about the fingernails and the toenails, the fingernails, the hair, we can also talk about the garments as well. And clothing is very culturally dependent from one culture to the next. So the way this week's Torah portion starts out, yes, we have something involving partnering, man and woman coming together and marriage. And that's something that we find throughout numerous times in this week's Torah portion. But we also have clothing. And like I mentioned, this is only the first. So the next one is, and I just want to say, this is a really interesting, what this week's Torah portion opens up with is a really fascinating aspect. Not everybody likes it. It definitely, I want to say, it may not jive with today's modern sensitivities. It's definitely been something that people struggle with. But I really just wanted to highlight the clothing aspect here. Now, the next one is at the very beginning of chapter 22. If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. You have to return it. Now, if this person does not live near you, and or you don't even know who this person is, you shall bring this. It seems it's an ox or a sheep gone astray. You should bring it back to your house, and you keep it. It shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. And you shall do the same with his donkey. And you shall do, and this is important for us, you shall do the same with his garment. And so too shall you do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. Okay. So we have clothing here. So what happens if you find someone else's clothing? Any manner of clothing? It's interesting because the first few examples are all living creatures that easily have legs and can walk. Those easily get around. But clothing here, of course, after it mentions garment, it says anything else. Okay, so anything else, people lose things all the time. But garments, I guess garments, they don't necessarily grow legs, but we have a garment here. And but that's important. If you I think that's true even till our time. Yes, anything, but certainly clothing. If someone loses a piece of clothing, it's definitely a very nice thing to return it to this person, and that's a mitzvah. That is a very important mitzvah that we have here in this week's Torah portion. It's something that it happened in biblical times. It very much still is with us till today. Whether someone loses sunglasses, a sweater, whatever it is, it's a good thing to return items to their owners. Okay, now this is what we have right after this section in the 5th verse of chapter 22 is about cross-dressing. Now, this is so there are 3 aspects of this verse. A woman must not put on a man's apparel, nor shall a man wear women's clothing, for whomever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord your God. Okay, so I'm not going to go terribly into to all of this, but what is kind of interesting, even though there is somewhat of a structural similarity here, that if we have we talk about a woman here, and that we also, right, so you have that in English, woman, and then also that we have gever. So this is the same man. It's a gever is a man, but it's almost like it's more than just a man. It's because normally we would talk about ish and isha, a man and woman, but gever here, it almost has a different, I don't know, it sounds a little bit different. Okay, but here's where we get into some main differences. We talked about man and woman here, but this is fascinating. Kli and simlat, okay, and then also Yilbash and Yihia. So this is where things get a little different here. They're fairly parallel, but there's some noticeable differences. That it should not be that the man's items should not be upon a woman, and nor should a woman dress. Nor should a man dress with the clothing of a woman. So that specifically, if one is to closely read this, that men are not supposed to wear women's clothing specifically, and that the items of men should not be upon a woman. So what's the difference here? What isn't on what is on men clothing? So there's one opinion in the rabbis. So one of the rabbis says, well, there's a debate actually the rabbis have. They say, oh, it's just the same, these are different ways of expressing that men shouldn't wear women's clothing and vice versa. But they say, no, actually, what does this mean? Kli? What does this mean? Vessels, tools. It even means implements of war, swords, anything used for fighting. And that's specifically the kli gever. It's not just a man stuff. Like what do men usually have on them? It's not like they have, I don't know, earrings or whatever. It means these are things that are specific to men, because back in biblical times, men went out to war, not women, and that women shouldn't be wearing, shouldn't have tools of war, as it were. And then for men not to wear women's stuff, common commentaries say that the concern there is for men then to gain access basically to women's spaces, and then who knows what can happen. So that's something that the rabbis point out. Okay, actually, in the very next, oh, not in the very next. Okay, so that's in the 5th verse. A little later on in the 22nd chapter, we have verse 11. Lo tilbash sha'anez tzemer ufishtim yachdav. You shall not wear clothes combining wool and linen. Now, we do once again have the word tilbash, which is to wear. It's a strange term here that we have in Hebrew. Well, I don't know if it's Hebrew, but it's here shatnez, which does not sound like a Hebrew word at all. And it actually, so this combination is something that is still observed till today, to not combine clothing that involves both wool and linen. So that's something that people avoid until to this day. But it is a strange word, shatnez. Like, what is this shatnez? So that's that's actually an interesting clothing proscription. So we have here one proscription, something that it's a prescriptive mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that tells us what we should not do when it comes to clothing. So this is one thing: do not cross dress. And then we have later on in this chapter, we have another proscription regarding clothing. You shall not wear clothing that combines both wool and linen. And then we have, so those are some proscriptive ones, right? Things that prohibit. Now we have in the very next verse, these are actually two consecutive verses, verse after verse, right? That was verse 11. Now we have verse 12 here. In the very next one, there's another clothing related commandment. And instead of a proscriptive, it's a prescriptive mitzvah. It's a something to do. Gedilim ta'aseh lach al arba kanfos kesuscha asher techaseh ba. You shall make tassels on the four corners of the garment with which you cover yourself. So this is known as tzitzit. It's actually earlier mentioned in the Torah about these tzitzit wearing four-cornered garments. But here's just a quick little reminder verse of this mitzvah. Once again, this is a prescriptive commandment. This is a prescriptive mitzvah. And now, when it comes to wearing these tassels on people's garments, I think people most familiarly know them when people wear tzitzit on a tallis. We have talitot, we have tallises in the CRCC, in both the temple and the synagogue, which people commonly wear when it comes to morning prayer services. Although there is also a practice, so that is a talit, okay, so that's a tallis, but there's also a practice to wear what is known as a talit katan. Now this is something where people wear under their garments. So I commonly wear one. So I'm only going to show you this part of let's see, this part of it, and then there are tassels actually underneath that I wear to in fulfillment of this prescriptive commandment, this mitzvah. I think it used to be that wearing four-cornered garments was actually quite common as outerwear. And so when doing so, you would then attach tassels. Of course, we no longer do that regularly. We don't normally wear four-cornered garments. We have our shirts or dresses or whatever they are, but we're not wearing four-cornered garments. And that's where this comes from, this notion of wearing this talit katan, this undergarment that has that is made out of four corners, and at each corner has these tassels attached, so that people may on a regular daily basis easily fulfill this, and not just during prayer services, but even throughout the entirety of the day, that people can continue to perform this mitzvah. Okay, so we had the very first one at the beginning involving this beautiful woman, and that she is to remove this clothing. We have the second one, which is if someone else loses their piece of clothing, whatever clothing it is, you return it to them, or at least you endeavor to return it to this person. Number 3 is the the gendered cross-dressing prohibition. Number 4 is not mixing wool and linen clothing. Number 5 is attaching tassels to the corners of four-cornered garments. And now we come to the sixth and final appearance in this week's Torah portion involving clothing. Now, this one, it's not as obvious that clothing is involved, but I'm just gonna read these verses and we'll see where it is. This is in verses 10 through 13 of chapter 24 in Deuteronomy. When you make a loan of any sort to your countryman, you must not enter his house to seize his pledge. You must remain outside while the man to whom you made the loan brings the pledge out to you. If he is a needy man, you shall not go to sleep in his pledge. You must return the pledge to him at sundown, that he may sleep in his cloth and bless you, and it will be to your merit before the Lord your God. Now, what we have as far as now, it's not obvious that there's clothing involved, yet we have, if he is a needy man, this is verse 12. If he is a needy man, you shall not go to sleep in his pledge. You must return it so that he can sleep in his cloth. Now, it could simply be a blanket. Who knows? Maybe some other thing in which people sleep in, but it sounds like something that someone would sleep in. Clearly, this needy person really does not have much. Maybe they just have the shirt off their back. At least return that to them so that they're not so cold at nighttime. So that's an interesting mitzvah, an interesting commandment right there when it involves clothing. So, we have these 6 mitzvot in this week's Torah portion regarding clothing. Clothing is something that is a daily thing that we all do. We all wear clothing, and that actually goes back to the very beginning, almost one of the earliest stories in the entire Torah. Really involves, when Adam and Eve are in Gan Eden, they're in the Garden of Eden, and they discover as a sort of you could describe it as a foundational morality of humanity that people should wear clothing vis-a-vis other people. So that's a foundational cultural aspect, social aspect, the necessity to wear clothing. And as such, we see 6 instances in this week's Torah portion relating to clothing that helps shape our conduct, especially with regards to other people, or even between us and God, right? We have certain things I mentioned at the outset of the woman, the captive woman. So she discards her garments. Now there it seems to be she's going from one culture to another, but there are others. As the second instance of clothing in this week's Torah portion has showing to us concerning what if someone loses their clothing? It's just even one piece of clothing, you should still return it to them. And we have in the final thing, if someone is a really poor person and they gave it to you as a loan, at least give it to them for the night. Allow them to have that for some comfort. So clothing is important, something that humans interface with and deal with on a daily basis. So it's no surprise that we encounter clothing in the Torah. And here are this week's Torah portion has a half dozen instances relating of commandments, of mitzvahs relating to clothing. Before I close off, I just want to acknowledge that all Jewish life and programming here at Cedar Village are made possible through the financial support from the Jewish Home of Cincinnati. So I want to say thank you. And with that, I want to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom.